I want to talk about Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, John Bunyan's spiritual autobiography, and how to analyze the work towards writing something about it in a literature class or a class that asks for that sort of writing. And there are a couple things you can do with this. And as I've asked you to do, you can compare it to the genre of spiritual autobiography. You would first have to draw up that type of genre. What is the type of writing that looks like this? What is its history? What is the tradition of this sort of thing? And then you can show how John Bunyan's Grace Abounding fits that. And again, that's sort of an obvious thing. It's been overworked. It's been well done already. And now you might be able to write something to show how, yes, it fits within this category to some degree, but there is an element of uniqueness to it. Now, if you can find that element and highlight it, then you can break away from the well-trod path of comparing it to spiritual autobiography and make the case that it goes a little more complicated than that, it's a little more developed, or it has some features that make it truly its own work. The other way to go about actually writing something from John Bunyan, there are many ways to do this, depending on your creativity and your time that you put into it, and the level of understanding you've reached as you read and reread and read even a third time the work. And of course, I haven't asked you to do that, but there's profit from that. Is to look at what I term motif. In other words, to see if you can find an element that he seems to place inordinate amount of emphasis on in the work from the beginning to the end, and see what you can make of that. All right, for example, it's pretty obvious from what he talks to you about in the beginning, how he has evaded death. Remember, at one point he talks about falling into a lake or a river and not knowing how to swim, but somehow he was able to wade to the shore. And that was one time he escaped death. And then another time he escaped death was when he was walking along. This was before he had come to grace. He was walking along a pathway, and there was a snake, and he hits the adder. He hits the snake on the head with a staff, and then he picks it up, and he's trying to pull out the tongue. Because, at that time, people thought that the poison of the snake was in the tongue. All right, the sting was in the tongue. I don't know if they thought that it was in the fangs. Now, I mean, you can check me on this. Maybe I'm. But there's a lot of talk about pulling out the snake's tongue, not just in Bunyan, but so that's the sting of the snake. So here he is thinking, I'm going to get this dangerous sting out, and of course, the tongue is nothing. It's the fangs he's probably rubbing against that could kill him. But so I mean, he escaped death in ways he didn't even know. But and then he tells you about when he was in the army. He had a duty, a mission that night, but some other friend wanted to go in his place, right? And that other soldier went in his place and stood exactly where he would be standing, and then a musket ball gets him right in the head. And Bunyan realizes, had I gone that night, I would now be dead. See, now all of this, at this point, Bunyan knows he's in a sin. And he's much convinced at the beginning of the book that were he to die at any one of those moments, he would be damned forever. So you should get the sense, and if you go back to look at the beginning of the work, you will see this, that Bunyan is afraid of dying. He's afraid of the first death, and he's especially afraid of the second death, which is the eternal death of the body. The eternal death of the soul carried out through the eternal punishment of the body. So he's extremely afraid of this. Now, in his mind, he does have the two levels, the first death and the second death, and it's there in the book. So the book can be, and he ends. If you look at how he ends, he still says he's afraid of the second death, which is stunning because this is written in a believer's maturity. But he confesses to you that at times when he is allowed moments of doubt and fear, as if God's grace temporarily backs away so Bunyan can be reminded of his mortality, of his own perverse mind outside of grace. He falls back into this default mode of doubting and fearing death. So it's throughout the book. It really is. How might a man this much concerned about dying the first and second death, defend himself against this? And if you look at the preface, he starts off saying, "My dear children," and he's writing to people in his congregation. But he refers to them as his children, okay? And you know, I don't want to pull this in because I want to try to stay within. Well, I don't want to pull it in too much, but at the beginning of Pilgrim's Progress, in his apology to the reader, he talks about giving birth to the poem that's to follow. So Bunyan takes on himself a function of generation. Okay, he's generating life. Okay, he's generated spiritual children by the time he's writing the book, and he reminds them of it. And then, so that's in the preface. Now, if you start off and you look at what he does with women in the work, and he highlights them, and it is through the women that he first hears talk of this new grace. Remember the women sitting together in the sunshine? It is a woman that rebukes him sharply and makes him, for the first time, feel the pangs of his sin when she says, "You are the worst for sinning, and you'll destroy the youth of this town." So, if you want to talk about nurturing of a growing individual, which is what a mother would be concerned about, the opposite of this would be to destroy that child. And the woman reminds Bunyan, that it says, at this point, you are doing the opposite of what a good mother should do. So it's as if Bunyan, as he writes and as he thinks of himself as a Christian, as a pastor, is really viewing himself as a matriarch here, giving birth to new believers, newborn believers, and nurturing them and growing them, okay? So, remember that passage when he has a dream, and in his dream there is this circular space that is enclosed by a tight wall, but the wall has a very small, narrow, circular opening, and he has to squeeze through that opening in very tight, it's like a birth canal, into this open space where there's a lot of light. Okay, now in Spanish, if you want to talk about giving birth to someone, you say, dar a luz, bring him to the light, give him the light. She gave her the light, you know, so in other words, the mother gave the daughter the light when she birthed the daughter. So this is a birthing process that's being figured here, and Bunyan finally gets into that space, and he talks about how narrow that pathway was, like a narrow birth canal, and he's finally there in the sun with the other believers. Okay, so throughout that you can trace this birthing imagery, and how he refers to how he defends the act of his own writing to his audience by saying, "I write this so that when you go through your troubles, my children, you can be strong and live through them and not fail and die in them." Why would someone who's so scared of death take on that aspect or that role of the matrix, the womb? Matrix in the sense of the origin of life, and could it not be his defense if he can prove by writing the book and having it help others that he is bringing life to his congregation? Does not that also prove that he himself is alive? Because it was a dictum and it was understood in that day, and I really can't think of an exception now, but I'm sure if you go into microbiology you probably can. But it was understood in his time that living things could not come from the dead. Okay, so if living things are coming from him, he must be alive. And if he can watch his book do this, it's another voice, an external voice, that's telling him, "Bunyan, you are alive in grace. Look what this work is doing. How can a work that does this come from someone that's dead?" And that might be what, in other words, I'm saying the writing of the book and the publishing of the book. Now, he was very serious about publishing this book, and I think it went through 5 editions. It may have gone through that. I might be thinking about Pilgrim's Progress, but it certainly went through a couple editions in his lifetime. And it was distributed and read by his congregation. So why was he doing this? Why did he want people to read this and think of him? And his express purpose here is so that they may make it through this. It could be that he's using the book to prove to himself, as he watches it give life to others, through God's grace, that he also has been chosen to be a living vessel, which would quiet his persistent perennial fear that he in fact is a damned soul. It's worth a thought, and writing a paper on that could work. In fact, that was one of the chapters of my dissertation. So when you start noticing how he talks about death so much, and then he starts talking about the birth process so many times, and having children. You put the two together, and maybe you can make something of it. So that's one way you can approach the work.